Good evening, traveler. Tonight, I want to tell you about a quiet, elvish settlement hidden deep within the magical forest of Whispergrove, and an old protection that could only be renewed with the help of something lost and someone long absent. So settle in and let us unfold this story together. There are moments in Whispergrove when the forest chooses not to announce what waits ahead, not to conceal it, but to ensure it is found only by those already listening. It was during such a moment that I came upon the elvish settlement. I had been following a familiar path when it simply failed to continue as it always had. There was no barrier, no warning. Only the quiet certainty that the forest had decided I had walked far enough in one direction and not far enough in another. In the space where the path ended, the village was there, woven into the trees rather than built among them, its structures shaped from living wood and careful patience. It was early evening, not the sort that brings urgency, but the slower kind that suggests something has already begun to change. The light rested gently against bark and leaf, lingering rather than pressing onward, and the air held the last warmth of the day without insisting it be noticed. The elves noticed me at once, not with alarm and not with welcome. Their attention shifted as a whole, subtle and unified, like tall grass bending beneath a passing wind. A few paused in their work. Others straightened, listening more closely than before. No one reached for a weapon, no one smiled. That, more than anything, told me why I had been led there. I stopped where the path dissolved into soft ground and waited to be approached. It is rarely wise to step farther than one is invited, and forests tend to respect those who understand that distinction. An older elf came forward at last, his movements measured and unhurried. His hair had gone pale with age, though not white, and his eyes carried the particular steadiness of someone who had spent many years watching the same borders hold, and recently begun to notice them falter. "You are old Thomas," he said, not as a question. "I am," I replied. He inclined his head. "Then the forest has not abandoned us entirely." "I would not say that," I answered. "It rarely does things so decisively." He considered this, then gestured for me to follow. "Come," he said, "there is something you should see." The village revealed its troubles slowly. Nothing lay broken. No trees leaned at dangerous angles. The air held its warmth properly, and the light settled where it should. To an untrained eye, everything would have seemed exactly as intended. Children moved quietly between dwellings. Fires burned evenly. Water flowed where it always had. But as we walked, I felt it, the faint looseness at the edges of things. Sounds did not linger as long as they should. Shadows did not settle fully. The space between the trees felt slightly wider than before, as though the forest were holding itself at a careful distance, attentive but unwilling to draw closer. "The ward is thinning," the elf said quietly, as though naming it too loudly might hasten the process. "How long?" I asked. "Long enough that we can no longer pretend it will mend itself." The ward, as it turned out, was old. Older than most of those who now lived within its reach. It had not been raised by the elves themselves, but set in place generations ago by a human wizard, one who had known how to ask the forest's permission and how to accept its conditions without complaint. It was not meant to be permanent. Most things that are meant to last forever fail early. To renew it, the elf continued, we require two things: the knowledge of the one who bound it, and the anchor that was tied to it at its making. I stopped then, allowing the space between us to acknowledge the implication. You do not have the anchor. No, he said. It was removed, not recently, long ago. At the time there was no reason to believe it would matter. And now the forest remembers where it was taken from. That too mattered. The wizard, I learned, had left the region many years earlier, not in anger and not chased away. He had simply gone where his work no longer pulled him back. The elves had sent for him more than once since then, but he did not answer summons, and he did not return for old favors. He will listen to you, the elf said. I would not be so certain, I replied. He will, he said again gently, because you know how to approach him without asking. There was little more to say after that. They chose one of their own to accompany me, an elf of quiet bearing, neither young nor particularly old, whose task would be to carry the anchor once it was found. He met my gaze with calm attentiveness, not eagerness and not fear. That was acceptable. We set out before night fully claimed the forest. The path we took was not difficult, but it was particular. It curved where straight ground lay open and narrowed where space allowed it to widen. More than once, the elf glanced toward routes that would have been quicker, only to correct himself without comment when I continued elsewhere. After some time, he spoke. You have walked this part of the forest before. Yes, I said. It feels different to us now. It often does, I replied, when something has been waiting. The air cooled as we moved deeper. The sounds of the village fell away, replaced by the quieter exchanges of bark and leaf and distant water. Nothing followed us. Nothing hurried us onward. That was when I knew the forest had already noticed our purpose, and that when we reached the place where the anchor rested, it would not be our strength that decided whether we could take it. The forest grew quieter the farther we walked. Not emptier, never that, but more selective. Sounds arrived one at a time, chosen rather than scattered. A bird's call would carry, linger, and then be allowed to fade before another took its place. Even our footsteps seemed to wait for permission before settling into the ground. We did not speak much. The elf had learned quickly that silence was not something to be filled, and I had no reason to disturb it. When we stopped, it was because the forest suggested it. When we continued, it was because standing still had finished saying what it needed to say. It was near the end of the path's patience that the land began to fall away. The ground sloped gently at first, then more decisively, until the trees thinned and the ravine revealed itself, not dramatic, not sheer, but deep enough that one noticed the space beneath, rather than the ground ahead. Moss clung to the stone walls in slow, careful patterns, and a thin ribbon of water traced its way along the bottom, too far below to be heard clearly. The anchor lay across that divide. A narrow shelf of rock curved out from the far wall, no wider than a careful stride, its surface worn smooth by time rather than use. Near its end, settled against the stone as though placed there deliberately, rested the object we had come to retrieve. It was unremarkable at first glance. Small, dense, wrapped in layers of old bindings whose purpose was no longer immediately clear. It did not glow. It did not hum. It did not call to us. But the air around it held a different weight, as though the place itself were aware of being approached. The elf drew in a breath beside me and stepped forward. The ground answered at once, not with movement, but with sound, a low, unsettled shifting beneath our feet, as though the stone had adjusted itself slightly out of alignment. A small cascade of grit fell from the ravine wall, striking rock below before disappearing into the distance. The elf stopped, tension settling into his shoulders. "This place," he began, "does not respond well to hurry," I finished. He looked at me then, frustration flickering briefly across his expression. "The ward weakens even now." "I know," I said, "but this place knows nothing of that." I stepped onto the shelf first, slowly, letting my weight settle rather than press. The air tightened for a moment, then eased, like a breath released after careful consideration. I did not continue. Instead, I stood there and waited. The forest adjusted. Minutes passed. The elf shifted once, then stilled himself. The faint unrest beneath the stone softened, its complaint reduced to a distant murmur rather than an immediate objection. "This place does not deny passage," I said quietly. "It denies urgency." Understanding understood more easily when it was not chased. When I moved again, it was with the same unremarkable pace. The elf followed, matching my steps without effort now. His breathing slowed, his attention no longer fixed on the object ahead but on the ground beneath him. Together we crossed. At the far end of the shelf the anchor lay within reach. The elf hesitated, then knelt, lowering himself so his weight spread gently across the stone. Only then did he lift it, cradling it rather than gripping it. The ravine answered with a long, settling sound, not displeasure, but acknowledgement. The tension bled away from the air, warmth returning in small increments. Behind us, the shelf felt no narrower than it had before. We returned the same way we had come, unchallenged. It was some time later that the forest began to feel inhabited again. The wizard lived where paths forgot themselves. No markers led to his dwelling. No boundary announced his presence. One simply walked far enough into a part of the forest that had no interest in visitors, and if one was still welcome, the ground would allow the approach. He was older than when I had last seen him, though not in ways that weakened him. His hair had thinned, his movements slowed, but his eyes remained sharp, assessing not who we were, but why we had arrived. "You bring something that was meant to stay put," he said, before either of us spoke. "Yes," I replied. He looked at the anchor, then back to me. "And you bring it because it must move again." "For a time," I said. He exhaled slowly, more tired than annoyed. "I told them not to rely on it forever." "They did not," I answered. "They relied on it long enough to learn what it was protecting." That seemed to satisfy him. He took the anchor in his hands, turning it once, feeling the way it rested against his palms. "It will not hold the same way again," he said. "It was never meant to." "It does not need to," I replied. The work did not take long. He did not travel back with us. He did not need to. The forest carried the change as it was made, binding the ward anew through old paths of agreement and careful permission. The anchor warmed briefly, then cooled, its task complete. By the time we returned to the village, night had settled fully. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Sounds lingered again. Shadows lay properly at the roots of things. The space between the trees felt held rather than merely occupied. The elder elf met us where we entered. He did not ask questions. He did not inspect the anchor. He simply nodded once, as though something he had been listening for had finally answered. "You will stay," he said hopefully. "No," I replied. "There is nothing here that requires me." He inclined his head, accepting that without offense. I left before morning. The forest released me without ceremony, as it always does when business has been concluded properly. Behind me the ward held, not rigidly, not forcefully, but with the quiet assurance of something no longer being asked to do more than it should. Some protections are not meant to last forever. They are meant to endure long enough for those within them to learn when to stand, when to listen, and when to ask for help in the right way. Those lessons, at least, tend to remain. The embers glow low and steady beside you now, their warmth quiet and unhurried. The forest rests easily beyond the reach of the firelight. Boundaries hold where they should, not by force, but by understanding. That is the story of the elvish settlement hidden within Whispergrove, and of the protection that was not repaired by haste, but renewed through patience and careful listening. I'll remain here a while longer, tending the fire, listening as the forest settles back into its evening rhythms. All is as it should be. You are safe to rest. Good night, my friend. May what shelters you endure only as long as it is needed. And may you remember that some protections return not when they are demanded, but when they are asked for at the proper pace.